And if it's left unchecked, you can become that 1% of fathers who are just totally devastated by what happens in family court. And I'm not talking about those fathers who are struggling and fighting to remain involved. I mean those that have been so steamrollered that they're clinging on to life by a thread.
Now, I believe you have an article that's on your website as well as ours called Divorce 101, and it outlines 7 steps. Can you go through each step, if you don't mind, just for our listeners who have tuned in on the internet? Because we also have what's called Ask a Lawyer, and if there may be some follow-up, and then they can click on that on dadsdivorce.com, our website, click on Ask a Lawyer and submit questions, and we may have some follow-up.
Oh, great, sure.
So, and I think it's important to kind of introduce what you think that the 7 steps are. I read through the article and was looking at what your analysis was, and I would agree with you on the 7 steps, but I think if you could kind of highlight each one and maybe personalize it, or what you think, how the parent can use that as an effective tool to basically wage peace, not war type approach, I would appreciate it.
Sure, I'll start with that, Dan, and it all comes down to closure. Now, when you're first separating, closure is probably the furthest thing from your mind, and yet at the same time, we hear this all the time from dads that we work with, that they just want it over. But closure is incredibly important, ultimately, for the children. Now, one of the reasons this is so important, and closure all comes about because there's a resolution that comes around. Resolution is so important for the children. Again, if you really care about your kids, and I'm not saying any dad that might be listening to this doesn't care about his kids, but oftentimes we get so wrapped up in the stuff that's going on in our own situation that you're stressed, you're dealing with your attorney, you're dealing with more papers that have just come through, you're angered by what's in that documentation, or perhaps you're in mediation and it's not going well. I mean, there's so many things that go on. The first step that we always focus on is step 1, and that's invigoration. And, you know, in short, basically when you go through a separation or divorce, there are 4 stages. The first stage is denial, which then leads into the second stage of anger, and then the third stage of grieving, and then the fourth and final stage is acceptance. Now, those don't always flow as quickly and evenly as I've just described. I mean, sometimes going from the first point of denial to acceptance can sometimes never be arrived at, and sometimes it can take years. So why is invigoration so important? Because when you're going through this process, the level of stress is enormous, and this is emotional stress. And we find often men aren't perhaps as equipped to deal with their emotional stress as we women. As I can go cry in a corner, I can cry with my girlfriend, or whatever. Physical activity, or invigoration as we call it, whether you like to jog, swim, run, play racquetball, tennis, it doesn't really matter what type of physical activity it is, but start implementing this into your regular schedule because it will decompress that stress level.
Now, step 2 is communication, and this is learning to apply the following 4 skills. Regulation of your self-talk, so that's what's going on inside your head. Number 2, reframe how you describe a situation to yourself and others, and I think that this is a huge problem for a lot of dads, is sometimes when they're talking to others don't want to hear it because of the way that they're putting it to them at such a level of intensity that it's hard to listen to. Then number 3 would be persuasion, and by learning to tone it down and learning the skills involved in persuading people, you can then get to number 4, which is influence. And then these skills help you to begin moving forward in a positive, proactive, child-focused way because you've taken the time to take 2 steps back, take a deep breath, and gather your objectivity. A book that I would recommend highly to any father who's going through the divorce process, and you don't even have to read this whole book because there's checklists at the end of each chapter, is Dale Carnegie's How to Win friends and influence people. This is a book that goes back to the turn of the last century, and it's one of the largest selling books of all time.
Now, the step 2 dealing with communication, that would also involve not putting the children in the middle, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Because I know a lot of times clients would have a tendency to have their children advocate for them or for the other parent, and therefore they're unfortunately being put in the middle. In order to reach the final step in the communication with influence, I would think that one needs to separate the children from any type of communication dealing with the court proceedings or feelings towards the other parent.
Very often I found in my own situation when the children would come to me with things, and sometimes this can happen instead of the father going to the children or the mother going to the children, sometimes the children will come to the parent. They would come to me and they'd want to try and figure something out because they're hearing it one way from me and they're hearing it one way from their mother, in terms of values, not necessarily criticism. And when it would come down to the point where it would start to enter into criticism, I used to come back all the time with, you really don't want me to say bad things about your mother, right? And they would shake their heads and say, you know that we don't agree on everything, yeah? Well, then why don't we just go to Dairy Queen instead? Forget about it.
Yeah, depending on the age of the child, you really don't want to focus. First of all, children should not be brought into the litigation whatsoever. Children, even young adults or late teenage children, have not got the life skills or the mature relationship experience that their parents would have, and they don't understand all of the situations that can crop up from being angry at each other right after being married for several years.
And that communication sometimes doesn't even necessarily have to be verbal. It can be the way your behavior is. Let's say when mom is routinely late bringing the children to the pickup place, or routinely late in picking them up, if that's the end of the bargain that she's supposed to be holding up. The kids get something out of that, and I can tell you from being an adult child of divorce, none of us were stupid when all this was going on. We knew what was going on, who was doing what, and what was going on. The difference between being an adult and child, though, is that this is your first time. So you know what's going on, but you're looking at it and going, but is that real? And who is it that you go to for confirmation of reality when you're a child? Your parents. And when both parents are saying something different, no wonder you end up confused.
Do you offer any type of tools that someone could go to or resources to help educate them on how to help facilitate the communication between them and their children, as well as, quite frankly, between the two parents?
Well, every Sunday evening we do a telewebcast called Divorce Dad Weekly, and you can find that at divorcedadweekly.com. We do regular training and question and answers on these very topics.
Yeah, and we are actually going to be launching a membership site later on in the fall of this year, and there'll be more and more information along those lines, Dan. We're developing a lot of great tips for dads and for moms.
And there's actually going to be, sometime after the membership site opens up, a coaching program where, in essence, the biggest problem I think a lot of fathers face is the enormous cost of litigation, and without any kind of skill set to understand what is effective and what is ineffective. Sometimes fathers want to throw money down a toilet for something that they're not going to get without understanding why they're not going to get it, and understanding that if they were looking at this in a strategic sense, that sometimes you got to be the smartest person in the room and know when to call it quits, so that if you're dealing with a mother that won't obey any court order that is ever constructed by a court, that actually this is where your advantage begins to begin turning it around if you know when to call it quits. You got to know when to hit the gas and when to hit the brakes. So the coaching program is positioned in such a way that picture, if you've spent $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in legal fees, well, 1/10 of that would be the cost of what one of these coaching programs that we're looking at putting together for fathers would cost. And in that, they would learn the insights and skills of those fathers who have actually been successful. Because when you want to succeed at something, you need, specific coaching, performance coaching, and guidance from people who have actually done what it is that you want to achieve. So